Today, we start The Prince, Chapter 1, Part 1. We have no weapons. Well, we'll have to find a way to make them. How? There isn't a blacksmith in the whole land of Israel to make them. The Philistines made sure of that. Those they didn't murder, they took captive. Jonathan sat with his father Saul beneath the shade of an olive tree. His uncles, frustrated and angry, bewailed the latest Philistine raid. Even if we could make swords, what good would they be? Whatever the Philistine swords and spear tips are made of, they're far superior to ours. Bronze isn't strong enough. It shatters against their blades. I choke on my pride every time I have to go down to Ajalon and pay hard-earned shekels to a stinking Philistine so he'll sharpen my plowshares and sickles. If I need an axe sharpened, I have to answer question after question. Another laughed bitterly. I need my pitchfork repaired this year and new points for my ox goad. I wonder how much that's going to cost me. Saul stared off toward the fields. There's nothing we can do about it. The Philistine outpost at Geba was only a short distance away, and it was the duty of Saul's tribe, the Benjamites, to keep close watch over it. Kish says what we need is a king. Saul shook his head. You know what the prophet Samuel said about having a king. The Philistines have kings. That's why they're organized. If only Samuel were like Samson. Instead, all he does is blame us for what's happening. Jonathan looked at his father. Grandfather Ahimaaz said, the Lord our God is more powerful than all the gods of Philistia. The uncles exchanged sallow looks. Jonathan leaned forward. Grandfather Ahimaaz said when the Philistines killed the high priest's sons and took the Ark of the Covenant, God went to war against them. Their god Dagon fell face down before the ark, his head and hands breaking off. And then the Lord cursed the Philistines with tumors and plagues of rats. They were so afraid, they sent the ark back on a cart pulled by 2 milch cows and loaded with gold. Saul shook his head. That was years ago. One of Jonathan's uncles flung a pebble. God leaves us alone now to defend ourselves. Jonathan felt confused. But if the Lord... Saul looked at him. Your mother tells you too many stories about what her father said. But they're true, aren't they? Another uncle snorted in despair. It was years ago. When was the last time the Lord did anything for us? Saul put his arm around Jonathan. There are things you don't yet understand, my son. When you are a man. Saul! At the sound of Kish's angry shout, Saul removed his arm from around Jonathan's shoulder and stood. What now, he grumbled. I'm here. Jonathan's grandfather strode across the partially plowed field in his fine robes, with them billowing around him, the red tinge of his cheeks betraying his temper. His younger sons scattered like chaff before a strong wind, leaving Saul alone to face their father. Saul came out from the shade. What's the matter? His question fanned the flames. What's the matter? You have to ask me? Saul's face darkened. If I knew, I wouldn't ask. You're out here sitting in the shade, and my donkeys are missing. Missing? Saul frowned and looked off toward the hills. Yes, missing. Have you no ears that you can hear? I told Misha to watch after the donkeys. Jonathan gulped. Misha was an old man, easily distracted. No wonder the donkeys had gone missing. Misha? Kish spat in disgust. Misha? Saul spread his hands. Well, I can't be in 2 places at the same time. I've been plowing a field. Plowing? Is that what you call sitting under an olive tree talking with your brothers? Kish shouted for the rest of them to hear. We'll have enough food for all of you sitting around talking. We were making plans. Plans for what? War. Kish barked a harsh laugh. We would need a king to lead us to war, and we have no king. Where are my donkeys? He made a fist. Saul stepped back out of range of a blow. It's not my fault Misha didn't do as he was told. You'll lose the oxen next. How long do you think you'll manage without animals to pull a plow? I'll put you to harness. That's what I'll have to do. Saul's face reddened. He stalked back to the shade. Kish followed. I'll I put you in charge. I didn't want a servant watching out after my donkeys. I wanted my son watching them. You have more than one son. You're the eldest, he cursed. Misha was an old man and is an old man and a hireling. What does it matter to him if my property's lost? You're the one to inherit. If you had to put someone over those animals, why didn't you send Jonathan? He would have kept close watch over my property. Jonathan cringed. Why did his grandfather have to pitch him into the fray? His father's pride was easily pricked. Saul glared. You always blame me when anything goes wrong. Father, I'll go look. No, you won't, both men shouted. I'll send one of the servants. Saul turned as if to leave. Kish yelled, No, you won't. You'll go yourself. And don't give me excuses. You're not going to sit out here on your backside and wait for someone else to find what you allowed to wander off. Take a servant with you and go look for the donkeys. Kish strode back toward Gibeah, still shouting. And don't even think about riding a donkey. There's only one left, and that one stays here. You can search on foot and take someone with you other than Misha. Saul kicked the dust and muttered. Eyes blazing, he stormed across the field toward home. Jonathan followed. His mother, Ahinoram, stood in the doorway waiting for them. The whole town had probably heard Kish shouting out in the field, I filled 2 water bags and stuffed 2 packs with bread. His father scowled. You're so eager to have me go? She put her hand against his heart. The sooner you go, the sooner you will be back. I'll go with you, father. Ahonim followed Saul inside the house. Jehiel knows more about donkeys than any man in Gibeah, Saul. Take him with you. Jonathan can continue the plowing. But mother, she gave Jonathan a quelling look. With both of you gone, nothing would get done. Father, the Philistines may have stolen the donkeys and taken them to Gibeah. The garrison was not far away. We should go there first. His mother faced him. You're not going. Your father has enough to do without having to watch out for you. Jonathan's face went hot. I can use a bow better than any man in Gibeah. Your father is going to find donkeys, not start a war. Enough, Saul snarled back. Pack me enough bread and dried fruit to last me a few days. There's no telling how far those donkeys have wandered. His wife moved quickly to do his bidding. Saul muttered and stormed around the room, kicking things out of his way. When he saw Jonathan still standing there, he jerked his chin. Go and find Jethiel. Tell him to hurry up. I'll go, Jonathan backed toward the door, but what if the donkeys are in Gibeah? Saul flung his hand into the air. Then they're gone, aren't they? And Misha will wish he had done what he was told. They wandered off, Ahonim spoke in soothing tones. That's all that's happened. You'll find them before the sun sets, my love. She shoved more bread into the sack. The Philistines have more donkeys than they need. Besides, they covet horses. Saul shouted after Jonathan, Tell Jehiel I'm ready and waiting on him. Jonathan found Jehiel hard at work repairing the wall of an empty sheepfold. Kish is sending my father out to find some stray donkeys. My father wants you to go with him. He's packed and ready to go. Jehiel straightened and brushed his hands off. I'll gather what I need and come. Jonathan followed him. You could tell my father that the sheep might escape if you don't complete your work. You could say, I can serve him as well as you. He had explored the hills and valleys all around Gibeah and even dared go close enough to the walls of Gibeah to hear the guards talking. The sheep are out to pasture, Jonathan, and there are 2 shepherds to watch over them. What if you run into Philistines while you're searching for the donkeys? You needn't worry about your father. We will avoid the Philistines. Even if by mischance we cross paths with them, I doubt they would bother with 2 men on foot with little more than some bread and some water to steal. Jonathan sighed. Before the 2 men left, Saul gripped Jonathan's shoulder. Finish plowing the west field. Keep watch over your brothers and know how they tend to wander. I wish I were going with you. Saul looked past him to Ahinoam soon. Jonathan went out to work in the west field not long after his father and Jehiel had left. His mother came to him. It was not her habit to do so, and he stopped the oxen to wait. Is something wrong? No, nothing. Sit with me in the shade and rest a while. Father wanted me to plow. I will not keep you from your work very long, my son. He secured the reins and followed her. She led him to the same tree where he had sat earlier with his father and uncles, listening to the talk of kings and war. Kneeling, she laid out fresh bread, a skin of wine, dried dates, and raisins. Jonathan's brows rose slightly. Perhaps she had meant to sweeten the words that would sour his mood. His defenses rose. She looked up at him. You are still upset you weren't allowed to go with your father. These are troubled times, mother, and he is too important a man to be guarded by only one servant. What if they meet some Philistines? Your father is looking for donkeys, not a fight. Women would never understand. You don't have to look for a fight to find yourself in the middle of one. His mother sighed. You love your father, Jonathan. In that, I know your heart is ever in the right place. But you must learn to use your head, my son. I saw you stand and watch your father and Jehiel apart. Did they head for the garrison? Did they go armed to accuse and ready to fight? She folded her hands in her lap. You would have urged your father to look in Geba first. Would that be in keeping with protecting your father or urging him into danger? But that's probably where the donkeys are. Just because a lamb is missing doesn't mean it's in the lion's mouth. Jehiel will try to track the donkeys. We can hope the Philistines had nothing to do with them. If they did, then they're gone, and that's the end of it. Jonathan rubbed his face in frustration. The Philistines have everything they can get their hands on. I didn't come out here to talk about the Philistines or donkeys. God knows where the donkeys are. And if it is God's will, he will let your father find them. I care more about my son than a few beasts of burden. She stood and squeezed his hand. I came out to tell you that I'm very proud of you, Jonathan. You have courage. I just want you to live long enough to have good sense. She leaned down and covered the bread with a cloth. If all Israel has its way, we will soon have a king like every other nation around us. And what else does a king do but draft sons into the army or make them run before his chariot? Your sisters may one day end up cooks or bakers or perfumers in some palace in Judah's territory, since Judah thinks it must be one of their own rather than a Benjamite to rule. A king will take the best of our crops and herds and give them to his assistants. He'll want a portion of everything we have. These are the things the prophet Samuel told your grandfather and the others who went to Ramah to ask for a king. Samuel speaks the truth. All you have to do is look around you to see. We're at the Philistines' mercy, mother. Would you have us sit and do nothing? My father, Ahimaaz, was a great man. He said we must trust in the Lord. God is our king. God has abandoned us. Men who say such things have no faith, and without faith we have no hope. His mother raised her hands in frustration. I know, I'm but a woman. What could I know? She raised her chin, dark eyes sparkling. But I do know that you are my son, and you are the grandson of Ahimaaz. Listen to his words, not mine. If a man is going to follow God, he must align himself with the men of God. Samuel is God's anointed prophet. He speaks God's word. Listen carefully to what he says. I wasn't in Ramah. How did she know so much of what was said there? I wish you had been. You have heard for yourself the words of the prophet rather than hearing your mother repeat what she overheard. She sighed. I came to say that many things could change, and it could happen quickly. While you work in the fields, pray. Ask the Lord what he requires of you. And what did the Lord want of him but to fight, to drive idol worshippers from the land? His mother studied him. Her eyes darkened and grew moist. She shook her head slowly and rose to walk away. A day passed, then another, and Jonathan's father and Jehiel did not return. His mother said nothing. The men gathered at Kish's table and complained about the Philistines, then complained about Samuel's corrupt sons who were now assigned to rule over Israel. Jonathan sat with his younger brothers, Mechulishah, Abinadab, and Ishabeth, and ate in silence, worrying about his father. Saul's cousin Abner cut off a portion of roasted goat. Samuel was not pleased when we met with him in Ramah. He took our request for a king as a personal affront. Kish dipped bread into the bowl of lentil stew. He's not long for this world, and we need a man to rule before he goes the way of all flesh. There are none like Samuel in the land. All too true, but his sons are despicable. They hold court in Beersheba and collect tribute like pagan kings. One of Jonathan's uncles reached for a cluster of grapes. They've been helpful in the past. Kish gave a harsh laugh, only because we paid them larger bribes than those who complained against us. Joel and Abijah cannot be trusted. They are greedy and will turn their rulings to whomever gives them what they want. And what they want changes from one day to the next. How does a man like Samuel come to have sons like those two? Kish, you convinced Samuel, didn't you, my brother? He said we would have a king. Kish poured wine. The question is when and who will it be? A Judean? Probably so, according to Jacob's prophecy. There's not a Judean worthy enough to rule over us. Why not you, Kish? You're rich. Kish's brothers and sons, equally ambitious for the tribe of Benjamin, were quick to agree. You are a leader of Israel, the greatest among all the tribes. You have influence. The other tribes grumble, but it's clear their elders look to our house to rule. Kish's dark eyes glowed with fire. I know they look to us, but I'm an old man. It will take someone younger and stronger than I am, a man of stature who will impress other tribes enough to convince them to stand behind him. Jonathan leaned in to listen. There was no man taller nor of more regal bearing than his father Saul. The 12 tribes must be unified. We need a king like the nations around us, a champion who will go out and fight for us. Jonathan thought of his mother's words about Ahimaaz. Ahimaaz had been killed by Philistines, and Jonathan had few memories of him. Other than that, he had not been like Kish. Kish was angry, loud, always making plans for war. Ahimaaz had taught Jonathan to say, trust in the Lord and the power of his strength. Kish believed God helped those who help themselves, and Kish ruled the men gathered in this room. They all believed that the Lord had left them to protect themselves and stand against the Philistines. Meant they must adapt the ways of the nations around them, nations who had powerful kings and large armies. Some even thought the gods of Philistia were more powerful than the gods of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. How else could they be so oppressed by the Philistines? Kish tore off another piece of bread. Samuel said, God will give us what we want. Every man in the room knew who Kish had in mind. The men had talked often among themselves. Saul stood a head taller than any other man in Gibeah. He had the famed handsome features of the Benjaminite tribe, descended from the youngest son of Jacob's beautiful and favored wife, Rachel. Men and women stared every time Saul attended one of the religious festivals. Not that he attended often. He would rather plow, plant, and harvest crops than attend religious services, even though he was required to go 3 times a year. Saul looked like a king, even if he had no ambitions to become one. Jonathan knew it didn't matter what Kish wanted. God would tell Samuel who to choose. As much as he loved and respected his father, he could not imagine Saul as king. But if not Saul, who? Abner? He was an able leader, fearless, uncompromising. Or Amasa, Abner's brother. Both men were of courage and strength, always talking over plans of how they would drive the Philistines from the land if God would just give them a king to pull the tribes together. They could talk, but could they lead? Jonathan looked around at his relatives. They were all eager for a king, intent upon having one, whether Samuel liked it or not. If his father were made king, it would change everything. Jonathan felt a rush of apprehension as a thought that he would then become heir to the throne. His mother's words pricked his spirit. Trust in the Lord. He is our king. Then why didn't the Lord destroy their enemies? Why did he allow the Philistines to oppress them? If God still cared, why didn't he deliver them? He had sent Moses. He had sent others. Every now and then it seemed the Lord awakened to their need and sent a man to deliver them. But years passed and no one had come. The only word from God came through Samuel, who said they were at fault. What was left then but for every man to do what was right in his own eyes? For it was certain no one had confidence in Samuel's sons to make decisions with their wisdom, with the wisdom and justice of their father. Jonathan had heard Samuel speak only once. but still remembered how his heart had quickened when the prophet reminded the people how their forefathers had been slaves in Egypt and how God had sent Moses to deliver them from bondage. God had sent plagues to free them from Pharaoh, had given the people water in the desert and rained manna from heaven. God had opened the Red Sea to save the Israel and then closed it back over Pharaoh's army. Whatever the people needed, God had provided. All the years they wandered in the wilderness and suffered under the blazing desert sun, they had water and food enough. Their shoes and clothing never wore out. When all those who had refused to trust in the Lord died, their children crossed the river Jordan and claimed the land God promised, Canaan, a land of milk and honey. Samuel said the Lord their God had driven out many of the Canaanites before they came, and then commanded his people to drive out the rest. The Lord had tested them to see if they would follow his commandments with single-minded determination. As long as Joshua, then Caleb, then Othniel lived, they had obeyed. But eventually, the people had grown tired of fighting and had given up trying to wipe the land clean. So what if a few enemies survived in caves and crags? God's people had tried, hadn't they? Surely God couldn't expect more of them than that. It was too much work to hunt down stragglers and finish them off. What harm to leave them alone? It was time to enjoy the crops, the flocks, the herds, the fruit trees ready for harvest. It was time to savor the milk and honey. But the surviving enemy had been like weeds. They grew quickly and spread. And now, here were the Philistines, a garrison of them only a few hills away. These people from the sea were powerful, armed, and arrogant. And they moved farther inland every year. No one in Israel did anything to drive them from the land. No one dared, especially now that not a single blacksmith could be found to forge a weapon. And how could 12 desperate tribes with countless leaders unite and fight against organized forces that moved beneath the command of a king? We need a king like they have. Without a king to unite us, we are defenseless. When a king unites us, we won't have to live in fear, wondering from day to day whether the marauders are going to come and steal our crops and animals. Animals! Jonathan felt a rush of fear. His father had not yet returned. How long did it take to find a few donkeys? God, please bring my father home safely. Did God even hear their prayers anymore? Had the Lord abandoned them, as some of his relatives claimed? Did the Lord expect them to live by their own strength and cunning? Samuel said if they returned to the Lord would deliver them from their enemies. But Jonathan didn't understand what the prophet meant. How had he left the Lord? The Philistines continued to encroach bit by bit, taking more territory, striking at every weak place, building strongholds, and God did not stop them. He didn't intervene and sweep in his mighty hand across the land, even though from history Jonathan knew it would be a small thing for the God who sent the 10 plagues on Egypt to send another plague or two upon the Philistines. Why didn't he? His mother had told him that his grandfather Amiaz used to say, every trial that comes will weaken or strengthen our faith. The Philistines increased in number and power every year. They dressed in their fine colored garments and armor, their thick hair like braided crowns, heads high, armed to kill, quick with mocking laughter and unleashed passion before their idols. They were a sight to see. Did their gods exist? How else did they come by such confidence in themselves and disdain for others? They were the conquerors, making themselves rich off of those they oppressed. Israel was stripped while God remained silent. The Lord had spoken to Samuel and told him a king will be chosen. Kish put his wine goblet down. Either he agrees that we need a king or he no longer plans to rule. Did Kish mean God or Samuel? Either way, Jonathan felt a chill spread through his blood. Could his father or any other man effectively rule Israel? Whenever the elders gathered, they bickered. They might believe in God, but they distrusted one another. Jonathan's mind wandered. What must it have been like to live beneath God's protection? The cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. What did manna tasted like? What it must have felt like to see the water streaming from a rock. Jonathan often yearned for the days he'd never experienced. He felt bereft, soul-starved. He used to dream of studying the law, perhaps even at Naioth, where Samuel was. The Lord spoke to Samuel. Samuel would know the answers to the questions that often plagued Jonathan. What did it mean to trust and obey God? What action should he take to please him? Clearly, the offerings did not suffice. God was far off, silent. Did the Lord listen to anyone other than Samuel? As great a man as Samuel was, as honest and upright as a judge, he paled next to the stories of Moses, who had brought the law down from Mount Sinai, and Joshua, who had conquered the land. Those had been the days when God ruled as king. God had gone out ahead of them in battle and stood at their rear guard. He had hurled hailstones down from heaven. Who could stand against a God like that? He made slaves into free men and frightened sheep into an army of lions. But where was the army of Israel now? The mighty warriors who once claimed their inheritance had produced frightened sheep that bleated over scant crops and drying water holes and lived in fear of Philistine wolves. What if Kish got what he wanted? What if Kish got what he wanted and lived to see Saul crowned king of Israel? Jonathan felt a rush of fear. His father was a farmer, not a warrior. Even now he might be dead. It should not have taken this long to find donkeys. Jonathan gave voice to his concern. My father's been gone too long. Can I go look for him? Abner frowned. Saul has been gone a long time. Kish considered for a moment, then waved his hand. It's too early to be concerned, my son. He's been gone 2 full days, grandfather. Kish gave a bleak laugh. 1 day to find the donkeys, 1 day to sulk, 1 day to return. If he hasn't come home by the day after tomorrow, then I'll worry. With your permission, I will go and look for him tomorrow. He could have run into trouble. The boy thinks he could take on some Philistines. Jonathan was 13 and a man. How long before they saw him as such? Be quiet. Should we dismiss a son's love for his father? Kish's eyes glowed with pride as he studied Jonathan, but he shook his head. Your father takes his time because he's angry. He'll be home in a few days. Jonathan wished he could be as certain. And that's the end of part 1.